The last Metroid is on clearance. The price is $5.
I first critiqued Metroid 1 year ago. Before that time, I had for the most part only seen the series through the fandom of others, though I had never been able to count it among my own favorites. And yet, spurred on by the incredible passion surrounding a fan-made remake, my interest grew. Suddenly, I found myself up in the middle of the night, utterly enthralled in adventures which I hadn't given enough of a chance to in years past. This raised the question, would Metroid be a good series to cover for the Geek Critique? A show that despite my best efforts was still lost in relative obscurity. Still, I hesitated to commit to a franchise I wasn't sure I would have a lot to say about. It would take a catalyst to push me over the edge, and that catalyst would come in the year 2016 of the history of the cosmos, on the 13th of September. Was it a coincidence that I found myself there, in that Walmart, on that day? The newest Metroid was a relic even then, yet there it was, wedged between two shovelware titles, and far less expensive than both of them. The opportunity to purchase what I knew was such a contentious game for such a pittance. I took its presence as a sign that I should take the leap, that I should critique Metroid. And so I did. I played 8 legendary titles spanning the course of 2 decades. I charted the history of the Metroid franchise, and every title I played only gave me a deeper appreciation, a deeper admiration for a series I had spent my whole life only hearing great things about. And where I was once worried about running out of things to say, something I didn't expect happened. I became a fan of Metroid. At last, I have reached the plateau. This is the culmination of a year's journey. It's finally time to peel away this plastic, critique this catalyst, and see what has been wrought by Metroid Other M. A year and a half after Prime 3 came out, it was revealed that Nintendo had been working on a secret project via a partnership with another developer. As I've recounted countless times, I wasn't much of a Metroid fan back then, but if I had been, I expect it would have gone a little something like this. Holy crap, you guys! Team Ninja is making a Metroid game! You know, those guys who made that Tough as Nails Ninja Gaiden game that I never got to play because I didn't have an Xbox, but whatever. Oh man, look at this. It looks like old school Metroid, but in 3D.
Remember me?
No! Seriously, my fellow 2009 peeps, Metroid Prime 2 and 3 were great, but I have been dying for Metroid to bring some more of that 2D style into the third dimension. The sharp kinetic combat, the focus on action over adventure, the speed booster? Oh, 2010 cannot get here soon enough. That hypothetical version of me, the one that played Fusion in 2002 and got to call himself a Metroid fan from then on, he would have been so hyped to see this, so hopeful, so optimistic. He would have made forum posts defending the game while it was in development, and he would have countered the naysayers by saying, hey, this is exactly what you guys wanted back when they revealed Prime and it was a first-person adventure. Give it a chance. Of course, that's not who I actually was in 2010. When Other M came out, you know what? This is another one of those things I've said so many times, but this is the last time I'm ever going to get to say it, so sing along with me. I rented the new Metroid, played it for a while, and came to realize it wasn't my style. Just another game that was not for me, and so I found it odd the way fanboys screamed. To me, this was kinda just another Metroid. But if, hypothetically, I had staked such a claim on Other M being successful, I'd have died on that hill, and I'm pretty sure most of you know that. Other M is not a case where I'm capable of going in blindly. Other M is a game whose reputation precedes it. Other M is one of those infamously bad games, and I've only encountered more of that bitterness since getting involved with the fandom. The majority of the Metroid fans I know seem to have a visceral, negative reaction to any elements of this game even being referenced. They would much rather Nintendo just act like it never happened. As a result, I am going into Other M with an unusual amount of baggage, knowing way more than I really even want to. It's safe to say that without even playing it, I know more about this game's flaws than I knew going into any other Metroid game. It has parallels with something like Sonic 06 in that regard, where even if you don't know anything else about this series, you know about this one. but I'm not expecting Other M to be anywhere near as dire as that. One odd aspect that kind of muddies the waters is how well the game reviewed on release. But where professional reviewers seemed to enjoy it at the time, a majority of the fandom almost immediately rejected it. Metroid is a series that lives or dies by the support of its core. And without that, Other M was a bomb. Nintendo forecast that it would sell at least 1 million copies of Other M by the end of 2010. But the game didn't even make it halfway there. Despite all that, Other M does have its share of defenders. I've seen a lot of takes claiming that it's really not that bad. So I'll try to keep that in mind to balance my perspective, and I'll do my best to come at Other M with an open mind, because I do want to let the game rise or fall on its own merits. With all that in mind, let's get critiquing. Oh, my bad, I loaded up a Windows 95 screensaver. From there we go to a baby in the womb. Okay, the baby is Samus. And, whoa, hey, it's Mother Brain, and, it's the end of Super Metroid! Oh, seeing it rendered like this is awesome, and wow, this cinematic is gorgeous! Like, how much budget went into this?
Time to go.
Samus, did you inhale a bottle of Ambien before fighting Mother Brain? But it turns out maybe she did, because this was all just Samus dreaming about the fight with Mother Brain, which seems like an odd way to get out of a flashback. Was she dreaming about herself as a fetus too? It'd make a little more sense if some time had passed since Super Metroid, but this opening scene is taking place directly afterward, with Samus having been picked up and tended to on a Federation ship. I don't know, shoehorning it in here as a non-interactive dream sequence, the opening seems a little too convenient designed to play on nostalgia, and I'm gonna have a lot more to say about that. But this is just stuff I'm ruminating on now. In the moment I first fired up Other M, there was one single problem that was overwhelming any other criticism that I might have had.
A dream. I had been reliving the tragic moments of my recent past. Thanks to the Hyper Beam, which was given to me somehow by the baby, I laid Mother Brain to waste.
Okay, I don't usually care to get into the details of the individuals who create these games. It's one thing for me to try to sort out what a development team was trying to accomplish, but it's usually a bridge too far to pin the blame for anything on any one person, especially when I can't source any first-hand accounts. The rare exception to this is when a game is the result of one person's vision. Smash Bros. Has Masahiro Sakurai, and in the same vein, there's really no way to discuss Other M without also discussing the man who has carried the burden of fault among fans and critics alike since its release. This is Yoshio Sakamoto, the man who directed, produced, and wrote the plot for Metroid Other M. And while I do intend to judge the game on its own merits, those merits ultimately come down to his decisions. Sakamoto is one of the co-creators of this franchise, and he played a pivotal role in every Japan-developed Metroid game aside from this one. He served as both the scenario writer and the game director on both Super Metroid and Metroid Fusion. At the time Other M was greenlit for development, Sakamoto had spent several years leading Nintendo SPD-1 in the production of the WarioWare series, and it was this group that would work alongside Team Ninja with Sakamoto at the helm. Sakamoto was given free rein to make this game what he wanted it to be. And you know what? Given that he played such a key role in making this series the legend that it was, if Sakamoto wanted to take the reins to such an unprecedented degree, I think he had more than earned the opportunity. After all, who would have more history and more familiarity with this series than one of the people who created it in the first place? With all that in mind, it seems a little strange that he seems to have forgotten the tiny, minor detail where Samus is not a robot.
Besides, they're extinct. The baby was the last of its kind.
Other M at one time was meant to take 2D Metroid's usual narrative approach. It might have had a little dialogue in the intro and ending, but the overall story would be told mostly through environmental cues and subtext. But while the game was still in the planning stages, Nintendo came to the realization that partnering with Team Ninja would give them a direct line to a studio called D-Rockets, which had produced cinematic CG cutscenes for Dead or Alive and Ninja Gaiden. And cinematic really is the operative word there. D-Rocket's work was on par with what you'd find in a blockbuster movie. With that, the entire scope of the project was changed. D-Rockets doesn't seem to get enough credit, one way or the other, in just how much their presence changed the face of Other M. The problem, though, is that Sakamoto wasn't just in charge of the overall plot. He also had final say on the way cutscenes played out. He dictated every line of dialogue, and he even cast and directed the voice actors. And this is where the cracks form. Because for as gorgeous as these cutscenes are, the way they're written and the way they're performed comes across with the uncanny awkwardness of high school theater.
I'm a bounty hunter, and I know that something is after you. Please, you must believe me.
It's almost like the person in charge of the production has no real experience. Because Sakamoto was just that. He was someone with no real experience. For all his accomplishments, Yoshio Sakamoto is not a movie director. He's a game designer. And that's not meant to disparage anything he's done, but writing the scenario and dialogue for something like Metroid Fusion takes a whole different skill set from writing and directing for a movie. And I think that's why these scenes play out so stiltedly. Of course, what compounds the problem is that Sakamoto, who doesn't speak English, was also directing the English voice cast when they dubbed the game. In Japanese culture, a character who is dry and unemotional in a dire situation will be seen as stoic and unflappable. But to the Western world, delivering lines with so little emotion makes someone seem robotic and inauthentic. And Samus stands out even more when most of the other characters have perfectly...
Looks like this might take some time now.
...passable delivery. It's only Samus's VA that was directed to be so wooden. It's a difference in cultural perception, and that happens all the time, but these are the kind of things that could have and should have been addressed in localization. As it is, it's the first thing anybody notices about Other M, and that in turn is only compounded by the script. Clunky, awkward, poorly translated dialogue in old school games could often hide behind the fact that it was all text-based. If you're just reading something and not hearing it, it's not as jarring, but in Other M this kind of thing is laid bare, as the game relies on an excessively literal English translation that sometimes makes the NES game's manual look good in comparison.
Becoming small and round was a certain maneuver I had done enough that it felt natural. But doing it knowing that Adam was watching, that certain maneuver became thrilling.
Oh yeah, I guess that brings us to every Metroid fan's favorite character, Adam Malkovich. Adam was first introduced, in a sense, back in Fusion. Or, is that forward in Fusion? Fusion, the game, came out first, but the story happens later in the timeline. There. Okay, but in Fusion, Adam was the nickname that Samus privately gave to the Federation's AI. Taking direct orders was such an aberration that it reminded her of her former commanding officer, a man named Adam Malkovich. But Adam wasn't just her commander, he was also a mentor in her more formative years. At one point in the game, Samus reveals that Adam died saving her life. This was a critical piece of Samus's backstory, and although it would have been sensible to assume that Adam's death might have been the catalyst for Samus leaving the military and forging her own path, his presence here reveals that wasn't the case. Still, Other M was meant to fill in the details of that story. Given how reverential and respectful Samus would be of a mentor figure, I don't mind the concept of her volunteering to take orders, or even limiting her arsenal. Where it falls apart is the execution. Fusion portrayed Adam as a mentor figure to Samus. In Other M, she describes him like this.
The closest thing to a father I had.
Except, remember, your other father who actually raised you? Your bird dad?
Her bird dad? What the crap's a bird dad? You're here to be a parody of Samus. What are you doing?
You remember Grey Voice?
Yeah.
And your other bird dad? You had two of those, actually.
Did anybody read the manga?
You had double the father figures who raised you to be a powerful bird warrior who gave you bird DNA so you could use the Chozo suit. They gave you all this awesome power that you have, but no, I guess they just mean nothing to you.
Are you done? Guys, I'd like to apologize for... You see what I mean about that visceral negative reaction? Seriously, Samus's line delivery is not the only reason she comes across so poorly. Samus's actions, her explanations, her decisions, and her characterization are all viewed through the prism of her relationship with Adam. And what's kinda skeevy about it is just how much of that is focused around Samus's role as a woman. And that's not me projecting anything, the game says it.
It touched me on some level that Adam would acknowledge that past by calling me something delicate, like lady.
This aspect of Samus's character has been treated as an almost incidental part of the Metroid universe. At only one point before had any character, whether in dialogue or in the manual stories, ever called attention to Samus being a woman. Not even in one of those defiant ways where, like, Runda says she's pretty good for a girl, and ends up having to put his giant ice-spewing foot in his mouth when she saves his life or something. It's just not a thing anybody seemed to care about. The lone exception to this was the Adam AI infusion, who, upon realizing that Samus was seeing it the same way that she had seen Adam, asked her this line. It seemed innocuous at the time, but I think it was meant to raise some questions and kind of hint at who exactly Adam was to Samus. Now, I do want to note that there's nothing at all wrong with a person or a character being stereotypically masculine or feminine, whether they're comfortable with who they are or struggling with the expectations. My point is that despite how significant it was here in the real world to have this ironclad heroine in 1986, Samus derived none of her in-universe significance from it. Even as the recent games became a little more plot-focused, Samus's enemies don't mock her for it. Her allies aren't surprised by it. In the confines of the series' lore, Samus's gender has absolutely no bearing on her character, her heroism, her role as this legendary bounty hunter. Until now, that is. Until the character herself has called attention to it. Even if Other M had pulled it off with a nuanced story that kept Samus as this strong character, that would still have been a risky, controversial road to go down. But nuance is lost here. Samus is emotionally compromised by the loss of the infant Metroid, which manifests in her droning on and on and on early in the game about the baby. When she receives a distress call, she describes it as a baby's cry, and then she meets up with Adam. Samus is not just respectful of her former CO in a professional sense. She seems at once frightened and thrilled by the very idea of seeing him again. Adam, in contrast, is in no way reverential of Samus or her accomplishments. He's biting and direct, and seems frustrated and dismissive of her mere presence, only tolerating her to the degree that she can further his goals. At its best, this character dynamic comes across pretty toxic. At worst, well...
Having received mission orders from Adam, I felt confused and strangely exhilarated at the unexpected turn of events.
Ugh. Alright. I'm not particularly interested or honestly well-versed enough to delve into it any more than this. As a rule, I don't see any reason to make statements on such contentious real-world problems on this channel, but the circumstances of Other M more or less demand that I at least bend that rule. But I'm also willing to bend it here because, contrary to what you always hear about the horrors of YouTube, the comment sections on this channel tend to be unusually civil and respectful. As a group, you guys have never let me down before, and I know you won't here either. If you're going to debate this aspect of the game especially, please approach it with that kind of nuance, and make sure you're attacking the argument instead of the person. What I'm way more interested in, though, is how this narrative decision filters down into the gameplay. There are always going to be aspects of games that we accept because they're games. In this series, it's stuff like, how come every place in the galaxy is teeming with magic icons that let someone wearing Chozo armor upgrade their suit? How does Samus's arm cannon hold or manufacture physical objects? Did I just download missiles? And really, why is it that Samus regularly sets out for dangerous missions without bothering to equip any of her upgrades from the previous game? How many times is she gonna rediscover the Varia suit? It can be fun to come up with in-universe explanations for this stuff, but really, a Metroid game wouldn't be much of a Metroid game if you could just obliterate everything with your best stuff from the outset. But if this really is the kind of thing that keeps you up at night, then I've got good news. Samus has decided this time to keep almost all of her upgrades from Super Metroid. But also, as soon as Samus meets up with Adam and his crew of GFS soldiers, she decides that despite not being in the military herself, despite being someone who has saved the galaxy multiple times by this point, she's just not gonna use any of that stuff until Adam says it's okay. Even the prompt that tells you this seems designed to be as irritating as possible. To be fair to the game though, this opening area does serve as a nice, natural tutorial section for learning Samus's core abilities. It's just a little undermined by the literal tutorial section that the game just made you play, where the most condescending character in the entire franchise so very helpfully goes to the trouble of teaching you how to use abilities that you might not have access to for hours. Seriously, I'm up for a debate on just how problematic Adam Malkovich is, but this tutorial dude is the worst. Heaven forbid you don't follow his instructions or have trouble with something.
What are you doing? Unleash that thing.
And even when you do get it,
sharp-looking charge beam. just the way I like it.
Other M, why do you think it's a good idea to start the game by talking down to the player? Where past Metroid games have featured some kind of roughly equal balance of action and exploration, Other M is much more decisively an action game, and it has the opportunity as an action game to take on the strengths of a more linear design. Where most games in the series take a naturalistic sci-fi setting on an alien planet, in Other M, which this game so totally is, Samus is going to have to make her way through a series of numbered, artificial sectors which are each themed around a different biome, which she will access via a structured series of elevators. The entire game takes place on a Federation ship, the BSL station. Wait, no, that can't be right. Hang on. Oh, it takes place on a craft called the Bottle Ship. You see how it'd be easy to get that confused. Forget about being linked to Metroid Fusion from a story perspective. Other M leans on its structure the way that Star Fox Zero leans on 64. Even the title theme sounds similar. This does all seem pretty derivative. But, you know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, I guess. Given that it's the first attempt at a 3D game in this style, leaning on the structure that had already been built for a linear action-focused Metroid game, I can give it a pass. Let's just keep an eye on what it's going to do differently. Samus meets up with the crew again, and it's only now that Adam expressly informs her that if she's going to help out on the mission, she's going to follow his orders.
You don't move unless I say so, and you don't fire until I say so.
That is hilarious, Adam. Okay, this is what we're gonna do, guys.
What actually happens is a lot worse. This small crew is ambushed by a mysterious, twisted entity.
Muno! You're right! He's tall and friendly!
From an aesthetic standpoint, Other M is a real mixed bag. The character models are rich and detailed, and although I'm gonna get raked over the coals for saying this, I definitely prefer this brighter, shinier Samus to her more realistically metallic appearance in Prime. She does stick out terribly next to the GFS Marines, though. In Prime 3, Samus also had allies, but the designs of those characters still felt contingent with her design. In Other M, the soldier's sleek military efficiency stands in sharp contrast to this giant yellow and red Japanese mech suit from the 80s, and I suppose that contrast was intentional. But there is one thing I really take issue with when it comes to Samus's armor. Late in the game, when the gravity suit comes online, yeah, you know what, let's compare. Here it is in Super Metroid. Awesome. Here it is in Fusion. It's a little ugly, but that was kind of the point. Now, here it is in Other M. It's just this purple glow. How in the world did someone with Sakamoto's experience think that this was preferable to this? For the more minor characters and one-off mini-bosses, graphics don't always hold up. This first boss, for instance, just doesn't fit at all with what Metroid creatures are kinda supposed to look like. It's an amalgamation of these little purple parasites, and I know the Wii wasn't a powerhouse or anything, but this texture just looks like it's made out of denim. In combat, the animations of Samus and her foes are fluid and impressive, helped immensely by Other M's commitment to a 60 FPS frame rate. Actually, moving Samus around is a lot more stiff and awkward, but we'll get to that. And the environmental graphics are like the swings and roundabouts core of these mixed bag aesthetics. The artificial environments hold up okay, incorporating the duress the ship's under and doing some cool lighting effects, but the more realistic the environment tries to be, the more the facade falls apart. Fusion's BSL station embraced the artificiality of its environments as part of its theme, and was way more cohesive for it. The bottle ship projects these holograms to simulate other worlds, and I swear, sometimes I think it's gotta be running on the Dreamcast GPU. What makes these simplistic, kinda generic environments stand out even more is that this was done on the same hardware. That makes it so much worse. Really just shows what a difference can be made by having strong, inspired art direction. Other M's environmental design does not even remotely compare to the careful and realistic attention to detail of any room in the Prime trilogy. By the way, do you notice anything missing? Metroid is a series that's known for wonderful music, the music that helps each area stand with distinction. In Other M, well, what's here is as good as ever, but so much of it is just this ambient noise. I'm having to pad out this video with music from other soundtracks and remixes. The lack of musical variety is all the more confounding when you consider that Other M is far and away the most navel-gazing, fan-servicey entry in the entire series. No, not that kind of fan service. What I'm talking about is how many enemies, bosses, and flat-out references there are to other games in the franchise. And look, I'm a Sonic fan. I really don't have a choice but to love nostalgic pandering at this point, and I do. But Metroid's approach to it has always been so careful to make sure that these illusions came with a reason, that it made sense within the story. It wasn't heavy-handed, it didn't feel like pandering. And I'm saying that as somebody who doesn't mind pandering, but it is yet another aspect of Other M that fails to feel like a Metroid game. Still, if you're gonna do it, go all in! This sequence where you're running through a tunnel getting flanked by enemies from the series past would have hit home so much more if this remix was playing. But no, it's just ambient ship noise. Hooey. With Best Genus defeated, at last! The dumb, heavy-handed story gets out of the way for a while, and we can finally just play our Metroid game! And look, I know the story is what everybody always makes a fuss about, but Other M really does have plenty of points like this, where Samus is, well, she's alone as she can be with Adam watching her every move. As much as I've said about the story and its implications, the truth of it is that it doesn't really make much of an impact one way or the other on my enjoyment of a video game. Which is not to say that I don't appreciate a story, but it's never gonna be why I play a game. Nah, my true love in this medium has always been gameplay. So let's get into it. And you know, maybe this is gonna be the best part of Other M. Like, you never hear anything about this. So it can't be that bad, right? Right? I have quite frankly spent more time than I ever intended or wanted to just trying to write this script. I have a ton of notes, but until now, it's like every attempt I've made to try to form them into something more cohesive has just been this overwhelming task. But I think I've finally hammered down the reason. Metroid Other M is a game with this heavy-handed approach to storytelling, but it's a game where that narrative, for all of its faults, is the point. That's one reason these pre-rendered cutscenes flow seamlessly in and out of the game engine. It's why the game has a theater mode where instead of playing a game, you can just watch a movie. I didn't add that. It really does call itself the movie. But the reason I've had so much trouble trying to figure out how I wanted to structure this is that all of that story focus seems to come at the expense of the game part of the game. Let's start with one of the series' defining elements, one of those things that you absolutely must get right if you want a good Metroid game: map design. The map is linear, and not linear like in Echoes or Fusion, where the area you needed to be in was clear but your path through it wasn't. In Other M, it's very rare that a room will even feature more than just an entrance and an exit. You come in, you press through, you move on. With only a few exceptions, it's just a straight series of rooms and hallways that eventually loop back on themselves. But hey, I guess that makes sense, right? It's not like we're exploring a real planet or anything. We're on a man-made ship, of course it's gonna be a little more artificial. I mean, Fusion might as well have been set in the same place for all intents and purposes, and they still managed to make the map resemble a Metroid game there, but whatever. I think there's a reason it's like this. Other M's focus is not supposed to be on that stuff. It's aimed squarely on action and storytelling. And look, I'm not inherently opposed to a more cinematic take on the franchise. One of my all-time favorite video game series is the stereotypical example for insanely long, overwritten cutscenes, but I enjoy that series. I come back to it because the gameplay at the core is so solid. Being so much more linear gives Other M the opportunity for more memorable set-piece moments, to force these obstacles that you can't just find your way around. Some of them, especially the puzzle rooms, are actually pulled off pretty well, and catch some potential of the benefits of this approach. The more action-oriented stuff that makes up the bulk of the game, on the other hand, well, in the entire series to this point, I can only think of two death traps. There's the acid pit in Metroid 1, and 20 years later, there's the insta-death thing in Prime 3. Yeah, I still don't get how Retro thought that was okay. But these are isolated examples from a series that spanned decades. So it's all the more egregious, because Other M is just teeming with instant game overs. The worst offender comes in the cryosphere, this ice section, and in fact, this serves as a microcosm of everything wrong with Other M's progression. I come to one of the relatively few rooms in the game with more than one exit. I take the north door, but I can't make it up this sheer cliff, so I try going left. At this point in the game, I've just recently gotten, I've been authorized to use the speed booster. And yes, I was very happy to see it back, and among everything else, I love the way they implemented it. Anyway, I use it to shine spark up to these rafters above the room, then make my way through a more fall maze to find a room with a switch that I can see, but I can't find a way to shoot. At a loss, I backtrack to the room with 3 doors, where I get assaulted by space pirates. They activate a field that they can fire through, but I cannot, and they just wail on me for a while. It looks like they've got Samus right where they want her, when...
Samus, You need a permeating shot effect to get past this. I'm authorizing you to unlock your wave beam.
Adam. After 30 seconds, he actually noticed I was in trouble and authorized the use of the wave beam. I guess I could have just stood there and died if he hadn't given me permission. Adam really does care about me.
With that, guess what I have to do now? Repeat the exact same sequence I just went through, get back to the switch behind the door, and use my newly earned privilege called the wave beam to raise platforms so I can move on. Doing this for some reason triggers an avalanche outside, and now Samus has to be cool, be wild, and be groovy. This power suit has stood up to undersea depths, the vacuum of space, massive explosions, and even plumber uppercuts. But gee, I guess being buried in snow is just something the Chozo never accounted for. I'm not opposed to giving Samus a voice and a character, and I'm definitely not opposed to a take on Metroid that's more action-oriented. I mean, I'd never want this to be all the series was, but just like 2D Mario and 3D Mario can coexist, something like this could stand alongside the more adventure-y 3D Metroid games. And the truth is, I could have overlooked all of this, from the map design to the progression to even Adam Malkovich himself, if the game's focus on combat was pulled off with any sort of aplomb. On the surface level, like I said earlier, combat looks nice. Characters move well, animations are crisp and clear, Samus's weapons have their usual nice pop. On that note, I've got to admire the way that taking a hit carries real consequences. The amount of damage here is comparable to Fusion, but that game incentivized combat the same way every Metroid game has. Enemies would drop items, or sometimes parasitic clouds, and that would restore Samus's health and supplies. Other M does away with this, and instead forces combat by frequently and arbitrarily locking doors to keep you from moving on until you defeat enemies. Killing everything in a room will also mark the spot of an upgrade on your map, which is great because I don't like looking for things, and games should really just cater to my preferences. Giving players an option was so 3 years ago. With no enemy drops, the only way to get Samus to full health is to hit a save station. But if you're taking such heavy hits with no way to restore your health, wouldn't that make the game a little extreme? Well, to keep this design from completely toppling over, Other M grafts 2 new mechanics into the mix. At any time, you can point the Wii Remote into the sky and hold the A button to re-download missiles. When you're low on health, the same movement will also restore at least 1 energy tank. But this significantly diminishes the triumph you'd always feel at coming across an energy tank, because you get hit so hard and can restore so little that they don't really carry much consequence. And honestly, the same thing also applies to missiles. The series has always had an abundance of missile upgrades as rewards for keeping your eyes open and solving puzzles, but in Other M there's little incentive to even bother. The amount of damage that I was taking and my lack of familiarity with the game meant that early on, Other M was kind of exciting. It can be really tense to try to stay away from an enemy long enough that you can restore your energy, and rewarding when you do. But as soon as I started to get a little more powerful, or to be more accurate, a little bit better at Other M, what made the difference was when I started leaning on one of Other M's most significant game changers, an ability called Sense Move. Tap the D-pad just before Samus takes a hit, and she'll dodge out of the way. Hold the fire button while you do this, and she'll instantly have a charge shot when she lands. The dodge has a nice rhythm, the sound effect is distinct, and it just looks cool. But I said I learned to lean on it, and that's the problem, because while the Sense Move feels great in isolation, in actual combat it becomes a crutch. There's absolutely no timing required to activate it. While dodging, Samus is completely invulnerable, and there's no cooldown on it. Your direction doesn't even matter. You can sense move directly into enemy fire and come out unscathed. So instead of skillfully dodging enemy attacks and then countering them, you end up just hammering the D-pad until you get an opening. And doing so is the best, most efficient strategy. Also, as good as it looks, it's not like you're going to be staring at Samus while fighting enemies, and the way that she flips around in either situation sometimes means it's hard to discern whether you have dodged a hit or took a hit. A good dodge or parry in a game like this should feel like a turning point. It should be that crunchy moment when your skill turns the tables on an enemy. In this game, Sense Move is so broken that it makes every encounter effortless and unvaried, and thus it's a tremendous contributor to why the combat, which inasmuch as the gameplay is gonna be the focus, is supposed to be the point here, is so freaking dull. Just charge your beam, release. Charge, release. Ooh, here comes an actual attack. What am I gonna do? I know, I'll just hammer the D-pad a few times until it stops happening. Video games. For the uninitiated, you might have noticed that Samus keeps twitching in place between dodges, and that's because the D-pad also controls her movement. You might wonder why something as critical as a dodge is on the same set of controls that moves the character. Shouldn't something like this have its own dedicated button? Of course it should, but it can't. Metroid Other M is played exclusively with the Wii Remote. Sakamoto was absolutely positively insistent that it needed to be this way. He cited how back in the NES era, the limitations of that controller inspired developers to come up with more creative, more intuitive solutions. And he's right, there is a lot of appeal and simplicity, but apparently at no point did he ever stop to consider that the NES didn't have a whole lot of 3D action games. Oh, but if only the Wii had come packaged with some kind of controller add-on that was specifically designed to give it functionality for more complex, more modern genres. Alas, 'tis but a fool's dream. In an Iwata Asks interview, Sakamoto said, "Instead of forcing the player to use complex button controls, we'd enable them to accomplish many things just using the Wii Remote by automating various actions in the game." Not that this will surprise anyone, but this sort of thing is one of my least favorite trends in the modern gaming industry, and this is where Other M really falls apart. The most damning result of this is in the core of your combat. When you fire the power beam, Samus automatically aims in the direction of whatever enemies she's closest to. This speaks more than just about anything else to how little respect and trust Other M is able to give its players, which is awful, because respecting the player's ability and intelligence is integral to the appeal of the Metroid franchise. Sure, the Prime games didn't require precise aiming either, but player action was at least the catalyst for what Samus was locked onto, and the focus was moved to deftly maneuvering her around her opponents in 3D space, and to knowing how to beat them. The important thing is that you weren't just spamming the dodge and fire buttons. They might have been presented differently, but skill and dexterity still played an important role, just as they always had. In any other Metroid game, when you made that tricky wall jump, when you dodged enemy fire and retaliated, when you broke that sequence, you broke that sequence! When you automate to this degree, the player's input doesn't have nearly the same impact on what actions their character is taking. So no matter how good it might look, there's not going to be any real crunch behind it. This tricky, death-defying leap looks really impressive, but this one feels so much better. It's the difference between spectacle for its own sake versus a spectacle that the game gives the player the power to create. One way they tried to spice this up was by including these little cinematic QTE sequences. Well, I say QTE, but all it really entails is just mashing the one button. Sometimes you'll be able to stun an enemy and then approach it for a glory kill. Sometimes you just have to realize that you can leap onto a foe to initiate that. Let's compare that to a later Metroid game. That, like Other M, wanted to prioritize action and combat, but actually managed to get it right. In Samus Returns, counter opportunities are communicated via distinct, consistent visual and auditory cues, and the cinematics that sometimes result from them still give you access to your full range of weapons. Other M doesn't have anything like that, so cinematic counters are instead communicated via this immersion-breaking hint text that has to come up in every encounter that requires them. But what about missiles, you whale? Missiles, those iconic Metroid upgrades that always brought a little variety to enemy encounters. You babbled earlier that you could restore them, so they must still be present to spice things up. Yeah, they're still here, but that opens up a whole nother can of worms. This is the point where Other M's control scheme crosses the line from being overly simplistic and does some things that are tangibly clunky. Point the Wii Remote toward the screen, and you'll snap into first-person view. Here, and only here, you can control what enemy Samus locks onto. Samus will only fire missiles when you're locked on from this perspective. You know, it actually isn't all that bad of an idea in theory. It'd make missile use that much more distinct. Unfortunately, like pretty much every idea Other M has, it falls apart in execution. For starters, of course, while you're in this first-person view, there aren't enough buttons left for you to be able to move the character. You can, however, still sense move, and your interface will even change color when this is an option. Though I guess such a concept was just too complicated to teach you in that tutorial. This is just something you have to notice yourself. Even when you do, the camera has to zoom out so we can see that fancy dodge, only to snap back into first person when Samus is done being a luchador. Aiming in the Prime trilogy worked so well because the Wii Remote is a fantastic pointing device. Prime was a first-person game, and so you had no problem keeping yourself oriented. Even when you come out of the morph ball, there's this little delay as Samus brings her cannon back up, to give you a small window to figure out where the pointer is. And of course, you could actually move your character if you needed a little more time. In Other M, when you snap to first-person view, there's no way to tell before you get there where exactly the center of the screen is, and so you can't reliably tell where your reticle is going to land. This isn't much of a problem when you're just using missiles to open doors, but in combat that's so fast-paced, those extra couple of moments of not being able to move can mean the difference between firing off a successful attack and taking a hit. It means that missiles in combat are way more of a liability. And so outside of the instances where I needed to have them, I just ignored them. They were too clunky. The first-person perspective is also used when the game forces you into search view, where you have to move Samus's vision around to notice something. Oh, this feels so unfair, but look at how it was handled in the Prime games. Scannable objects are clearly highlighted. In Other M, there is nothing to indicate what you're supposed to be focusing on, and while most of the time these sections are obvious enough that it's not a big deal, occasionally you're just stuck in first-person view and expected to sleuth your way out with no indication of what to look at. I spent upwards of 10 minutes standing right here, just spinning in circles. Do you see anything distinct or unusual about what I'm looking at? It's not the soldiers in front of me. It's not the truck behind me. Okay, here it is. Yes, you were expected to turn completely around and notice the green blood blending into the green grass behind you. And I'm sure this was even more of a nightmare in 480p on the original Wii hardware. Other M is a game that is forced to graft so many incredibly generous conceits in order to make a 3D action game function at all on a Wii remote that the best case scenario that Team Ninja could turn out with is exactly what this is. Bland, repetitive combat that's all style and no substance. Even just running around. Being locked to 8 directions in 3D space reminds me of those early PlayStation and Saturn games, before analog sticks became standard. It's just awkward to move sometimes, and it gets even worse in these strange, forced, over-the-shoulder moments. On more than one occasion, Samus is supposed to be trying to catch someone who's running away from her, and instead of chasing them down, she instead opts to awkwardly hobble after them. It doesn't take long for the game to get physically uncomfortable. Spinning that tiny D-pad around to move a character in 3D just wasn't something the Wii Remote was ergonomically designed for. Now, of course, I could have mitigated the whole issue to a degree by using the Dolphin emulator to play Other M with a more traditional controller. I could have activated first-person view by holding the trigger and moving the right stick. The game wouldn't have been so uncomfortable if I'd done that, but I chose not to this time. I decided that dealing directly with the limitations brought on by the Wii Remote was inherent to understanding Sakamoto's intentions with this game. I had trouble finding my voice with Other M because I kept trying to approach it with the expectation that if I could just find the right angle, I would be able to come to terms with what Sakamoto was trying to do. I'd find a way to dive deep into some appreciation, or at least an understanding, about why the game is the way it is. But looking for depth here is like diving into a kiddie pool. All you're gonna do is hurt yourself. Still, there are occasional sections where I actually felt a little glimmer of the potential that Other M might have had as an action game. Like, let's say, 3 sections. And they were all boss fights. Ridley, Nightmare, and the Metroid Queen all managed to seem like legitimate threats. They all make you feel like your skills and wits are coming together to overcome them, and they'll all take you down hard if you don't stay engaged. That the team was still capable of crafting enjoyable bosses, even through all these restrictions, shows better than anything the squandered potential that Other M had. Mind you, they're hardly perfect, they're hardly as good as they could have been. I'm not saying this is some epic sequence you must experience, I'm just saying that they're the lone exceptions where I actually find some fun in Other M's combat. Also, even amid all the other gratuitous fan service, isn't it bizarre that one of the bosses is Nightmare? I mean, he originally came from Fusion, a game that's in the future of the timeline during Other M. What, are we supposed to assume that every Galactic Federation ship just comes standard with a gravity control AI that will inevitably develop sentience and try to kill everyone? Because that really makes a lot of sense. These 3 bosses are the lonely islands in a sea of mediocre gameplay. Most of the time, Other M's combat feels more than anything like a smartphone game, like it's some cheap spin-off of the Metroid series. Tap the screen to shoot, swipe to dodge, move your finger around and find stuff in first person, earn Galactic Federation tokens, or buy them with real money. So Adam will authorize more upgrades. Even with all of this writing against it, I still don't think Other M would have quite the awful reputation it does if it weren't for the spectacular mess it makes trying to wrap itself up. Sector 0 is a place that's set up through the back half of the game as kind of the Torian equivalent, the climactic area where a bunch of Metroid encounters and the final boss will need to be taken care of. After a lengthy trek to get there, Samus encounters a small Metroid just outside the entrance. Same as the larva did back on SR-388, it hovers before her, causing her to hesitate. Fortunately for her, Adam shows up to shoot that varmint down. and proceeds to lecture us all about how these Metroids were genetically engineered to be unfreezable and vicious. Well, that's nice of him. It's just too bad that he only bothered to save Samus after he did this. Never mind what I said about Prime 1's dinky explosion knocking out Samus's upgrades. The idea that one shot from an ice beam would be enough to knock out Samus is, well, it's preposterous. It's not just that she has withstood much worse, she does withstand much worse in this same game. Of course, that's just me whining about the lore. The more pressing matter is, why in the world did Adam shoot Samus in the first place? Even Samus herself has the gumption to demand an answer.
So why did you shoot me?
You can't destroy these Metroids.
What? Yes, she can! She was just about to shoot it with the same ice beam you did. Even within Adam's own flimsy characterization, it makes no sense. The only reasonable answer, and I think the real answer, is one that can't be explained narratively. For this scene, Sakamoto wanted Samus in a position of weakness in comparison to Adam. He did this to put over how heroic and self-sacrificing Adam was being, to emphasize how much he meant to Samus, because after saving her life, he sacrifices his. Adam takes what would be in any other Metroid game Samus's place. He heads down into Sector 0, ejects it from the rest of the bottle ship, and initiates a self-destruct, killing himself along with the Metroids. This plot beat might have sounded like a good idea on paper, and it might have even worked in a game whose story was built on subtext. But how many times can I say this? It fails in execution. As a player, I was only half paying attention during what's supposed to be this big emotional scene because I just kept waiting for the game to justify why Adam would fire on Samus. And when it was over, I was irrationally frustrated at this character for not only failing to explain himself, but for taking away my agency, for taking my spot in the finale, and for not letting me go into Sector 0 and blast apart those Metroids. Because of all this, I was happy to see him go, and I do not think that was the effect Sakamoto was going for. Or was it? Given how much praise I heaped on Fusion for corrupting Super Metroid's formula, for weaving the loss of Samus's agency into its gameplay, and coming out all the more memorable for it, isn't it fair to consider Other M from the same angle? Let's get meta. Was the player meant to feel frustrated at how poorly the game handled its own protagonist? Maybe something like that could have worked if Samus redeemed herself at some point. And to be fair, there are hints of this. There's one earlier scene that got this huge smile out of me. At a point in the story where Samus thinks Adam has abandoned his post and may even be working against her. She comes to a chasm she can't jump over, and then...
Any objections, Adam?
And then she just activates her space jump herself. Oh man, that almost makes it worth it. Even her delivery there just nails the contempt I feel. The contempt that she should feel. Oh, and you remember that condescending jackass from the tutorial?
I gave your suit a polish so you'd be at least somewhat presentable.
Yeah, turns out he also took samples of Metroid DNA off of it. And that's why the Federation was able to clone Metroids in the first place. I think it's safe to say that he was supposed to rub you the wrong way. No, stop smiling at me like that! So, fair enough. Maybe some part of this was meant to make the player feel resentful about the game they were playing. Maybe they were supposed to relate to Samus in that way. Nonetheless, I can't at all say that Other M is some kind of subversive, misunderstood gem. Fusion intentionally corrupted Super Metroid as a means to stand on its own, outside the shadow of that masterpiece. Other M, on the other hand, fumbles every good idea it has, and so its corruption of the Metroid series as a whole comes out as a pure negative. The scene where Adam dies is the worst example, but the narrative and gameplay alike are absolutely full of moments that don't stand up to the slightest bit of scrutiny. If the Metroids were genetically modified to be unfreezable, how did Adam know he could freeze that one? Why does the bottle ship's development director look like a 14-year-old girl? Why do we bother focusing so much on the Marines early on if only one of them is ever gonna have anything resembling a personality? Most infamously, why does Samus have a panic attack at the mere sight of Ridley? a rival that she had fought and defeated so many times before. I said I prefer to focus on gameplay, so how did this moment get through playtesting? It's a Metroid Queen, which, yes, nostalgia pandering, but like I said earlier, it's also one of those few moments where the gameplay actually gets a little fun for a while. But when you have her on the ropes, she swallows Samus whole, and I guarantee that if you didn't know what to do, if someone hadn't told you beforehand, you would die here, and you'd probably do it more than once. Nothing you do seems to make a difference. So what do? You have to magically know that as of this moment, Samus has decided to use power bombs. There's no cut to the inventory like there has been for every single other authorization. There's no on-screen prompt telling you what's going on, you just have to know. And even if you do, you have to remember that the awful tutorial sequence from the very beginning of the game taught you how to use them. I figured it out after just dying once, but I feel like the only reason it wasn't a roadblock was because I've beaten the Metroid Queen quite a few times recently. At the time Other M came out, unless you had seen the end of the most obscure entry in the mainline series, and you happened to beat her this way, I have no idea how you were meant to put it together. But hey, with that done, it's time for the finale. No surprise, it's a nonsensical 20-minute cutscene that reveals that this woman isn't who she claimed she was. No, she's an android. And she was stealing the identity of this woman. And get this android basically is Mother Brain, accidentally recreated by the ever-inept Galactic Federation. Okay, I'm not gonna detail it because I don't really care, but I will say that it's a surprisingly satisfying twist compared to all the other crap going on in the plot. Well, it's not just that I don't care, but also because by the time the twist is revealed, it's too late for it to have any ramifications. I figured that Metroid Queen fight was just the build-up, and that the real final battle would be against this reborn Mother Brain. I mean, that makes sense. Ah, yeah, there she is. She summons vicious creatures to wage war on those that brought her into this world, and here we go. The very last bit of gameplay is a narrative segment that locks you in first person, where all you have to do is lock on to Mother Brain, at which point you're stopped before you can even fire. That's it. That's what you overcome. Same as Adam stole your Torian run, the Marines just kill Mother Brain for you, because that's a satisfying way to conclude a video game. Despite their similar reputations, I'm not going to pretend that Other M is anywhere near as bad as something like Sonic 06. It's not a broken glitch fest most of the time, and given the constraints of the Wii Remote, it accomplishes what it sets out to do pretty much as well as it could have. It's just that as a game critic, and even as a player, I'd much prefer an awful but interesting game to one that's so mind-numbing. Which sucks because as nonsensical as the story progression is, I could have laughed it off if the game was fun, and I would have accepted it being fun in either direction. If there was some combination of a genuine Metroid game and a competent Team Ninja-style action game propping up all this cinematic BS, then I could excuse the narrative faults as some kind of failed experiment. And there's a lot of fun to be had in that kind of unintentionally awful storytelling. Like, I love Shenmue, and it suffered from a lot of the same faults. A director who wasn't a native English speaker, awkward wooden acting, and an excessively literal translation. But it can be part of the charm. On the flip side, if Other M's gameplay was a buggy, broken, offensive mess that tried way too many ambitious ideas and failed to execute any of them, then it could have stood alongside the story as part of the total package. And at least to my tastes, Other M could have been a fascinating, hilarious train wreck of a game. But the story winds up coalescing with the gameplay in a way that's a little more personal to me. Neither one really makes much of an impact on me. I care about the way that they impacted the Metroid franchise, I care about the implications of the story and find them interesting to discuss, but I just said how I'd have no issue laughing at how stupid it is either. There's just nothing here that makes me care as much as I wish I did. And knowing how I am, and particularly why I do this, that alone speaks volumes about this game. If you can believe this, I am not the most mechanically articulate person on YouTube. There are so many critics out there with a better eye for design and storytelling. There are people with real experience in the industry who can give you genuine insight into things that I would never notice. There are certainly people who can make videos more consistently. But what makes this show, at least I hope, worth waiting for, is that I always manage to find a way to be passionate about whatever I'm covering, and I present that with sincerity. While I was playing Other M, it gave me no shortage of things to think about. The notes I took along the way dwarf any game I've played before, but the reason it's taken so long to put those thoughts together is because the experience didn't make me want to say anything about it, and I had no core drive to wrap my thoughts around. I didn't feel any particular way about this game, and I only got over that block and found my voice when I embraced that fact. This time I had to get passionate about nothing. Finding that righteous indignation would have probably been easier if I was reviewing the game in 2010, or if I was retrospecting at any time before this happened. Other M might have sent Metroid into hibernation for way too long, but at least we know that it didn't end the series forever. At the same time I was dragging myself through the bottle ship, I was also playing a return to form for Metroid, a game that excels in some of the ways that Other M failed. And knowing that Metroid Prime 4 is over the horizon, there's no reason to be anything but optimistic about the series' future. And so there's no reason I feel to be quite so vengeful toward Other M. I don't think there's any way that Nintendo would ever make this kind of mistake again. And you know, that's kinda sad. I got comments on Prime that claimed that people like me were the reason Other M exists, as if this is what I was asking for, as if this was meant to cater to me. I got much nicer comments hoping I would just go easy on Other M, hopeful that I would find something to love about it. And yeah, despite what a slog this was, I could still adore a more action-focused 3D Metroid game, a third-person adventure that's more evocative of the tenacity of the 2D series. So I can see why a few people were either afraid or hopeful that I would love this game, but I do not love this game. I love a few of the things that it tries to be, but it undermines itself at every turn. That just doesn't mean that I wouldn't love to see those concepts get another chance. But I don't think Nintendo will ever go there again. I think as soon as they showed something with even a surface-level resemblance to Other M, fans would tear the game to pieces. And so to someone with my preferences, that makes Other M even more of a resounding, frustrating failure. It's kinda bizarre. The same fanbase that once raged about a first-person 3D Metroid game would probably never be receptive now to anything but. If I ever decide to play it again, I'm gonna do kind of the same thing I did for the original Metroid, and use a fan-made hack to make it a little more palatable. Other M Maximum Edition attempts to fix the storyline as best it can. Most of Samus's wooden monologuing is gone, a lot of the stupid plot is cut, although the edits are very obviously fan-made. The scenes don't always flow well, and they do still come across a little hokey, though the fact that there's a lot less of it is still an improvement. But what's much better is that Samus can now fire missiles from third person, giving combat a little bit more variety. The concentration mechanic has been rebalanced and can't be used as a crutch during combat. The mod also shores up some of those ugly, low-res textures, and restores Samus's more realistic armor if you're into that sort of thing. I'm not. But I'll take the trade-off, since they also made the gravity suit actually look like the gravity suit. Best of all, the mod does exactly what I wish Other M had done, and implements remixed music throughout the entire game. Yeah, if you're inclined to give Other M a try, get it on Dolphin, set up your favorite controller, get this mod, and play it this way. Anyway, I'm glad I could find some way to approach this. I hope you've enjoyed the result, and until next time, you keep geeking, I'll keep... Oh my god, it's still going. It's a video game with an interactive post-credit scene. Why? Why won't Other M just be over? Okay, so... Samus gets authorization to go back to the bottle ship to retrieve some kind of important artifact. You know, I guess since the game was so linear, this was the only justifiable way you could go for 100% completion. You know me, I'm never gonna do that, but if I did, I'd unlock hard mode. Yeah, because you want to lock a higher difficulty behind a mind-numbing fetch quest that requires you to meticulously comb the entire bland map. You know, if the game's just not gonna bother ending, I guess I can throw in a coda too. As I played, I figured out a few things that could have made Other M so much more palatable. Here's how they could have fixed it. For the gameplay, it's a gimme. Don't tie the development team's hands behind their backs by forcing them to cram a 3D action game around the Wii remote. I would have loved to have seen what Team Ninja could do with a more robust control scheme. Or if you absolutely refuse to do that, if you just have to restrict yourself to the Wii remote, just have gameplay happen on a 2D plane. You can still have 3D environments in the first-person view and cinematic camera angles. You can still take advantage of the hardware, but locking the actual gameplay to 2D would have allowed the combat to work within these constraints. Fixing the story is not so easy. The whole thing would need to be rewritten from the ground up, but if Sakamoto really wanted to tell a story like this, then the change I'd start with is easy. Make it a prequel. Set it before every other Metroid game and tell the story that Fusion pointed to, the story of Samus's time in the Federation and the incident that caused her to leave it. If Samus is still a part of the Galactic Federation and actually is under Adam's command, then the whole authorization gimmick becomes so much more palatable. And that's hardly the only thing a prequel would have fixed. If this had been the first time that Samus had seen the monster who killed her parents since that traumatic event, then of course she might experience a bit of a breakdown, to say nothing of the way that throughout the game she's so much more unsure of herself, and the degree to which she looks up to and respects Adam. I mean, the one time that Samus's voice actress actually gets to show off what she can do is in this scene, which is taking place as a flashback.
Adam, please, let me go. You have to trust me. Just give me a chance.
And I think there's evidence that Other M might have just been a prequel early in development. Let's look again at that reveal trailer. The cinematics are almost all showcasing Samus's time in the Federation, as if that was all that was finished. The only reason I can think of to change course was because they wanted to pander to nostalgia and needed Super Metroid to have already happened. But of course that didn't stop them from throwing in Nightmare. And if you wanted to do nostalgia pandering in a more Metroid-y way, then Adam's sacrifice would have been the perfect opportunity. The turmoil of this moment could have been used to drive Samus forward, to give greater context and meaning to all those times that we as the audience know that she's going to stand alone against the Metroids in the future. Maybe we could have ended the game with a montage of that future, seen her taking out Mother Brain for the first time, watched as she faces Ridley with unwavering confidence, and even seen her using techniques and abilities that Adam taught her as a subtle sort of echo of how he helped her grow as a warrior. Yeah, Other M really could have been something. But back in the game that we actually got, I broke through to the bridge of the bottle ship. Oh, look, it's Phantoon. You guys love Phantoon, right? Remember him from Super Metroid? Look, he's here on the bottle ship, even though that makes no sense at all. But who needs boring things like lore and consistency and quality when we have nostalgia to pander to? Yes, there he is. He's busting through the windows and destroying the bridge. He's using familiar attacks in flashy new ways that couldn't have been done in previous generations. Oh, and now he's wailing on me with attacks, so it's a tense struggle to recover. He's whittling away at me, and I'm doing the same back to him, and holy crap, he killed me! This boss is awesome! Phantoon might not excuse the way Other M set up a Mother Brain fight and failed to deliver, but at least there is a satisfying fight at the end, no matter how little sense it makes. After that, Samus makes it through to the command deck, where she finds Adam's helmet. Look, Other M, it's far and away a lost cause. Can you please stop trying to make me care it's like the game heard me. It's time to drag this memento out of the bottle ship, and we'll be doing it via an epic escape scene. Taunting explosions, gripping music, holding the directional pad in one direction. Yeah, this whole sequence is kind of a summation of the game as a whole, and how it holds up in comparison to the rest of the series. It is an epic escape scene, but this time it's only epic because it looks epic. Other M is at its best when it's embracing the only thing it does well, being a brainless, overly accessible, but very flashy action game. Even now, if you apply any scrutiny, it all falls apart. Why does the Federation start blowing up the bottle ship when they should know Samus is still on it? Why can't Samus hold a helmet and activate her armor at the same time? How do I get past these doors? Oh, of course, you just shoot them with your pistol. Why not? But I understand why this game has its defenders. The awfulness of the gameplay probably does get overstated by fans who hold a vendetta against it for well-justified but also unrelated reasons. But if you're willing to turn your brain off and ignore the story, I can see the appeal in smashing a few buttons to guide Samus through some visually satisfying combat. I can even see it being a fun game to unwind with in small doses. Other M, in the best case scenario, is video game junk food. It's just, I get that it was meant to appeal to more casual players, and the Wii had plenty of those, but Samus Aran just doesn't have the recognition among the mainstream of a character like Mario or Donkey Kong. If somebody relatively unfamiliar with video games saw this on store shelves, I don't think they'd know what it was. Other M was never going to win over that crowd, and a game that tried to was never going to be anything but alienating to Metroid fans. Video game junk food might be enjoyable in small doses, but it's completely antithetical to what people love about this franchise. Other M fails as a satisfying action game. It fails harder as a narrative, but above all, it fails to even remotely live up to the series itself. Other M is a failure at even being a Metroid game. and this failure did cataclysmic damage to the series' reputation among its own fans, in the wider gaming community, and within Nintendo itself. Metroid's first Dark Age was preceded by a masterpiece, but its second was brought on by a catastrophe. Samus Aran would spend 7 years in exile. Thank you all for watching this ridiculous bonanza of an episode. Thank you to my patrons for making it happen. Thanks to Chad for providing the opening narration. To Kovar for the brilliant musical interlude. And thank you to my lovely girlfriend Alicia for taking the starring role of Samus Aran.
This is the worst thing that ever happened to me.
Despite this cataclysm of a game, I have had a lot of fun this past year, and I really do have all of you to thank for that. I'll be back with a new season in 2018, so I hope you guys enjoy your holidays, and until then, you keep geeking, I'll keep... Oh, it really is over. Critiquing!